Today's the first in a series that we're going to do on the book of Romans. This is probably going to run for close to a year. And one of the things you're going to notice today is the video is very different. The reason it's different is because we recorded it. For the first 5 minutes of the video, we actually found out that we had lost the audio. We didn't know that. So that's why I'm recording this introduction. After we get through a few minutes, we're going to splice into the existing audio, and you'll see the service as it occurred. But to start with, I'm just going to give you some brief background on what we're doing here. The book of Romans, in my opinion, is probably the most comprehensive book in the entire Bible for teaching the gospel, the Christian life, the false ways to get to God. Everything you can think of about God and the Bible and the gospel is summed up in the book of Romans. So that's one of the reasons why I enjoy teaching the book of Romans. Also, it's an incredibly logical book. Paul is unbelievably logical, and Romans, the thought pattern in it, the way it works through the book, it's just beautiful to look at it and see how it actually unfolds. Now, one of the things we're going to do today is we're going to study nothing but the background and the history of the book of Romans and the introduction to it. We're going to actually get into the verses next week, and the reason is because there are so many things that we need to understand that if we don't understand them, we won't be able to properly interpret the book of Romans. Even things as simple as what date it was written will affect how we interpret certain chapters. The first thing we need to understand is Romans was written by Paul, and it was written somewhere around the year 57 to 58 AD. That's important because 60 AD is another critical date that we're going to discuss in a little bit. Had the book been written in 62, 64, 65 AD, it might be a very different book in certain areas than it is right now, since it was written in 57 to 58 AD. So the thing to lock into your mind is it was written in 57 to 58 AD, and that came before a very critical event that occurred in 60 AD. Now, in addition to that, Romans has an unusual background as far as the church itself goes. The church was founded by Jewish believers, probably 15 years or so before Paul wrote the book of Romans, at least 10 years before minimum. And what happened is it was starting to grow up, it was starting to mature, it was primarily Jewish believers, but attracting a few Gentile believers. Somewhere in the reign of Claudius, which started in 41 AD and went to, I think, 54 AD, if I remember correctly, somewhere in there, many people put it at 49 AD, Claudius said, that's it, all the Jews have to get out of Rome. So he expelled all the Jews out of Rome, about 50,000 people had to leave. Suddenly you had a church that was a Gentile-only church, but it was founded by Jews and with Jewish roots. So they had heard and understand some of the things from the Jews, the Jewish believers, but they really didn't have a comprehensive overview of the Old Testament like these other Jewish believers would have. And it made a strange situation. To make it even more strange, in the early to mid-50s, all of a sudden the ban was lifted, and or at least wasn't enforced, and the Jews started coming back into Jerusalem. So you then ended up with a majority Gentile church with Jewish roots, but with some Jews coming back into the church, Jewish believers coming back into the church. Because of that, it ends up having some strange things as far as not only the background, but for example, the customs. The Jews had totally different customs the Gentiles did, different understanding of who God was because of the Old Testament. So it's important that we realize that, especially because we're going to see certain chapters are written specifically to Gentiles, others specifically to Jewish believers, and others written to everyone. So once we get that in our head, we'll be able to see it. In addition to that, when we cut into the tape, we're going to be reading out of Acts 18:2. That actually talks about the fact of Claudius expelling the Jews out of Jerusalem. Now we'll go ahead and cut back into the tape from yesterday, and you'll get to see the actual service as it occurred.
Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome.
Right. So we have not only the Bible, but we have secular history as well, telling us that Claudius told the Jews, get out. You're not welcome here anymore. We believe that probably about 50,000 Jews had to flee Rome at that point in time. So again, this happened fairly early in the church's existence, but it was founded by Jews. Then it became a Gentile church with Jewish roots. And then after Claudius left, suddenly the Jews, probably somewhere in the early to mid-50s, started to come back in. And you had a situation where the Jews were starting to come back in, but by the time this book was written, it was still a Gentile church primarily, but the Jewish people were coming back. So you got a really strange situation, unlike any other church that we had in the New Testament, where you had Jewish founding, then Gentiles, then Jewish, and back and forth like that. So it's a little bit unusual. The one thing also, let me ask you a question, is let's say, why does it matter whether it was founded by Jews or founded by Gentiles? When you start thinking about it, You start thinking about the backgrounds and the traditions they might have had. Can anybody think of anything where the Jews might have had a different view? I'm talking about believing Jews here. Might have had a different view of things than the Gentiles might. Any? Circumcision, that's a big one, exactly. The Jews were saying, hey, you got to be circumcised in some cases. The Gentiles, the idea of circumcision is like, what? You got to be kidding me. I mean, it was not in the Gentile thought process at all. What else? What was that? Sabbath. Sabbath, you're right. The Jews had the Sabbath, which was on Friday night to Saturday night. Gentiles had no concept of the Sabbath. What else? Robert.
Was this is just a question. The Council of Jerusalem, when they sent out the letters to the Gentile church in Greece area, did Rome, or do we even know that Rome also got that?
We don't know.
Yeah.
Now, I was going to say, especially, we really don't know, but it's a good point. We don't know. But the key is here, the Jews and the Gentiles that founded the church would have had different backgrounds. Anything else you can think of? Now, let me ask you, Mark. Clean and unclean. Let me ask you this. All the things you're saying, clean and unclean, Sabbath, circumcision, what are they all involved with? The law. I heard it from somebody. So the Jews had the concept of the law in their background. The Gentiles, this wasn't even familiar to them. Now, it's true. We're going to find out, we've seen in Galatians, we'll also see in Romans, Paul said the law is dead, but the problem is that still affects your thought processes. And not just the law, the other thing too that's big is, the Jews came from a tradition of there is one God. We know who God is. The Gentiles came from a tradition of there's many, 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 many gods, and they're all kind of equal and screwed up. So, not to say they believe that afterwards, but when you carry those backgrounds into your churches, it makes a difference in how you think. So that's what was happening there. One other thing here, it may sound little, but it's not. It was not apostolically founded. What that means is it wasn't an apostle that went out, it was just some believers that went out and started forming a church. Now the reason that's important, we're going to discuss a little more, but in the apostolically founded churches, you had more instruction going on. You had things like that were happening. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So to understand who this letter, we need to understand who the audience is, because some parts of the letter are written specifically to the Jews in the church, some parts to the Gentiles in the church, and some parts to the whole church. And it goes back and forth. So if you take and don't understand that and don't understand their backgrounds, it's going to be, well, why is Paul saying that? It doesn't make any sense. All of a sudden when you start seeing this, it's like, got it. Now it makes sense why he would say that. We're also talking about the church in Rome. Can anybody tell me anything about what the church would have been in Rome? I hear.
Not St. Peter's.
Not St. Peter's, exactly. You got it. There was no St. Peter's Basilica there, cathedral rather. What would it have been? Any ideas?
A home church.
Home church, exactly. The point is that in Rome, if you look in the last chapter of Rome, which Paul even talks about the churches in the houses of. And the point being is that the church in Rome was not some big building, not some cathedral, not some church building. It was literally a group of house churches that met. They met separately. Sometimes they'd probably get together. But when you think of the church in Rome, don't think of some big, large, organized place. Now, one other question I've got is, if you look at the churches in that part of the world at that time, the Roman church was not a particularly big church. It wasn't a church that was particularly glorious or anything. Why do you think Paul would pay special attention to the church in Rome, and why would it matter that there's a church in Rome? Any ideas? Either one. Go ahead, that's okay.
Rome was the capital.
Right. Rome was not only the capital, right? Same thing. Rome was the center of the entire world. I mean, today we talk about Washington, D.C. being the capital of the U.S. Well, that's nice, but how about if it was the capital of the entire world? Rome was everything, and not only that, it was a very large city. So the fact is that even though the church may not have been that big in Rome, it was still important, and that's one of the reasons that Paul wanted to come there. Now, what we want to look at now is the political situation in Rome, and this is very important to interpreting the book. Nero came to rule in 54 AD and ruled from 54 to, it's changed already. Nero ruled from 54 to 68 AD. Can anybody tell me anything about Nero that you've heard before? Burned the city of Rome, blamed the Christians, playing a spittle. Okay, good. Was he a good emperor or a bad emperor? Very bad emperor. Okay, does everybody agree with that? Okay, you're all right and you're all wrong. Because here's what's important. Nero was, up to that time, the best emperor Rome had ever had, and also one of the worst. Here's what happened. He became emperor when he was like 16 years old, I think. He was a teenager, okay? So what happens is this. He takes the emperorship, I guess that's the word, and he's got 2 advisors, and these 2 advisors are really good guys, okay? And he's listening to them. And for the first 6 years, up until 60 AD, it was actually called the Golden Age of Rome. Before that, you had these corrupt emperors. You had emperors like Caligula, who's just monstrously bad. I can't even begin to describe what he did. Well, instead, in these first from 54 to 60 AD, you had reform going on. You had, for example, tax collectors just take anything they want before it. No, you're a tax collector, you're only going to take what's allowed by the tax collector. If you're the governor of a province, he was actually expelling governors and locking up governors and saying, you're cheating the people, you're doing this wrong. It was unheard of in Roman history for an emperor to stop that. He stopped corruption. Not only that, he slowed down. A lot of the emperors were like, hey, I'm emperor, I got the gold, I can build anything I want to, and just keep building whatever. He said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to be fiscally responsible. Something we can learn from. But the point is that he said we'd be fiscally responsible. Not only that, Nero became extremely popular with the Senate, who was ruling, and with the lower classes. Now, when you become popular with the Senate and the upper class and the lower class at the same time, that's hard to do. And that says something about Nero. Now, before I tell... Question? However, we're getting to however, right. There is another shoe coming, or another... whatever, I'm mixing metaphors, but that's okay. Before I tell you about the however, I want to go on to the next. We're going to show you a few more pictures that I took in Rome, and these are all in a specific location, okay? In Rome, what you're going to find is, you saw the first picture of the Colosseum with the cross, and that cross is actually in the Colosseum. You saw the Colosseum. The Colosseum is located kind of down at the base of the hill, a Palatine Hill. Right along in front of the Colosseum, you've got this big area running down that's called the Forum. The Forum was the center of government. It was magnificent. It's wonderful to walk through if you've ever been there. It's where the Senate met. It's got the Arches of Triumph in there, everything else. All of this was at the base of the hill. On top of the hill, you had where the emperors built their houses. And the emperors lived up there, and they could look down over the Forum, and they could look across to the Colosseum. And if you've ever been there, you know what I'm talking. It's hard to describe. If you've ever been there, you know what I'm talking about. This first picture is up. All of these pictures are going to be from up on top of this hill that looks down over top of things, okay? This first one is of the Stadium of Domitian. Yeah?
It's on top of one of the 7 hills of Rome.
Yeah, exactly. Palatine Hill is one of the 7 hills of Rome, exactly. This first one is the Stadium of Domitian. You can't see it too well, but down in there, there's a big, like a track where they could run races and everything else down there. This is all on top of the hill. Let's go on to the next one. This is the Forum looking down onto the Forum from the hill. Gives you just a tiny little touch of what's down there. Again, I wish it was larger, but we can't do that. It's incredible if you stand there. You can't believe the size. I mean, if you could see the people in this picture, they'd be like little ants, that type of thing. It's just incredible what's down there. It's wonderful to look at. Let's go to the next one. Next one is again on Palatine Hill. This is part of one of the emperor's houses. This was the remains of it, and you can actually go through the place. Let's go to the next one. Next one and the next 2 are very important. These are some of the gardens out in front of the emperor's houses. Okay? And the next one. Again, beautiful location, the gardens in front of the emperor's houses. Now let's leave that one there for a moment, okay? Actually, I'll tell you what, we're going to go forward and then backwards, okay? I want you to remember that one picture we just saw. In 60, Nero either stopped listening to his advisors or went totally nuts, one or the other, okay? Remember, Nero was the nephew of Caligula, so he kind of came by his insanity legitimately. The whole line seemed to be an insane line. Caligula would do things like he'd host dinner parties with the senators. If you didn't show up, you'd be killed. And if you did show up, you had to bring your wife, and then the emperor Caligula would take your wife out to a back room and sleep with her and then come brag about it in front of your face and in front of all the other senators. Really nice guy, and believe it or not, that's not the worst that he did. So that was Nero's uncle. Nero took control. In 60 AD, all of a sudden became horribly cruel and corrupt. Now let's go back one screen to those gardens there. If you were invited to a party by Nero, again, you'd have to go. You don't tell the emperor, I'm sorry, I'm busy, okay? Doesn't work that way. You go to the party and sun sets and everything gets down, low light and everything. So what do? Well, they put torches in the garden. So what did Nero do for the torches? He took Christians, living Christians, not bodies. He dipped them in tar. He put them on stakes and he lit them on fire to light up his garden party. So the people would be standing there drinking, eating, having their stuff, and they'd be forced to stay there even though they're horrified with the burning, screaming, flaming Christians going up all around them. That was Nero. So what I'm saying is you had the best and the worst of all the emperors combined in one guy, and 60 AD is when it snapped. One of the things also is that even with some of the Roman historians believed that the Christians should have been executed because they were divisive. Even the Roman historians who believed that they were divisive and should have been executed were horrified by what Nero said and said, you can't do this. I mean, even they were horrified. So even by Roman standards of debauchery, this was just unbelievable to do this. But that's what and not only that, but to make the people attend. I mean, it's horrible. It's horrible being burned alive. It's also got to be horrible standing there, being forced to go to a party and watching the people burned alive so it can provide light for you and entertainment for them. Anyway, this is what Nero was. Now let me ask you let me say this, why this is important. Remember 60 AD, and I ask you to remember 57 to 58 AD. There are portions of the book of Romans that deal with things like how we deal with our government. And you probably will hear sermons somewhere else talking about how if Paul and the Roman church could live under the worst government in the entire world, how could they, and he said, obey them anyway. We certainly can't compare it to today. Well, you know something? When Paul wrote Romans, it was the best government in the world, probably the best they'd ever seen. It was 3 or 4 years later when it was the worst government in the world. So the point being is there's going to be things in Romans we hit. It's actually critical that 60 AD, when Nero snapped, happened after the book of Romans was written because it can change our interpretation of what it means. So that's why I said we need to learn those dates and need to know about that. Now the next thing we want to look at is, back to the next slide again. The next thing we want to do is we want to look at Paul, the author of Romans. Paul wanted to go to Rome badly. He really did. He kept talking about it. And I mean, it's like, I don't know if you guys ever have these bucket lists for things. I have my bucket list, okay? I've been to 49 states. North Dakota is the remainder, and I've been told, man, maybe it's not worth it. We'll see. Been to the rest of them for years now. I've been to, I don't know, probably about 35, 40 countries. I've been to 5 of the 7 continents. But there's one place that's on, and Linda and I have been to the Arctic twice, once in the summer, once in the winter. But there's one place on my bucket list that I haven't made it to yet, and that's Antarctica. I don't know if I'm ever going to make it there or not, but I keep thinking about Antarctica, and we've talked about it before. Well, Rome was kind of like Paul's Antarctica. He kept wanting to get there, and he kept being stopped from getting there by Satan, by spiritual forces, and he kept wanting to be there. And he knew about the Roman church because of reports from others. Because that church had probably been about 15 years in operation, but he couldn't get there himself. Now that's important to why Paul wrote the book of Romans. Could someone turn to Romans 1:11? That's right, microphone, your turn. Romans 1:11. Abby, you got it? Romans 1:11.
For I long to see you, that I may impart into you some spiritual gift, to the end that he may be established.
Right. So Paul wanted to see them, but Paul wanted to see them specifically so that he could impart training to them, or impart spiritual gift to them, and to establish them, to train them. Because what's happened again is he's kind of unsure of where they are because they weren't established by an apostle. And when it says imparting spiritual gifts, that's very different than today. I actually believe at that point in time, that was still part of the point in time where it was common to speak in tongues if you were saved. And that's something that's speaking in tongues and salvation have nothing to do with each other today. We're not going to go to speaking in tongues today, but the point being is that at that point in time, he probably wanted to go there, much like Peter did with Cornelius, where Peter showed up and Cornelius, all of a sudden, they started speaking in tongues. Whatever gifts he's talking about is the fact that he wanted to go there, and we're in a transition period, and he wanted to impart spiritual gifts, and he also wanted to instruct them. But he couldn't do it. So what happened is that he decided that since he couldn't go there in person, he was going to write this letter to them. And the one thing I love about this letter in the book of Romans, I don't believe there's any other book in the Bible that so completely encompasses the Christian life and the gospel and everything right from the beginning. It's amazing to read it because you have not only the plan of salvation, but you have why we need salvation. You have what happened with Israel. You have what do we do with our Christian life now. And all of that is in the book of Romans. I think what he wanted to see is, look, this is a mixed church. You've got the Mosaic law issues. You've got the other things. I don't know where you're coming from on this. I'm going to write one letter to you that covers absolutely everything. And that's what we have now as the book of Romans. He wanted to make sure that they were grounded in the faith properly, and that was the establishing of the church. And the other thing I want to bring up here as far as how Romans is written has to do with the flow of the book itself. The flow of the book of Romans is different than most. When I first studied, well, I don't say first started, probably about, before the first time I taught Romans in college, I sat down and looked at every verse in the book of Romans in the original. And I didn't look at all the verse. What I did was I looked at the words between the verse, the first words in each verse. And I made note, all right, here's how it's connected, here's how it's connected. And what I found is, when you look at the book of Romans, unlike a lot of others, yes, Paul uses long sentences. But almost the entire book from chapter 1, verse 1, right through chapter 12, verse 5 or 6, is basically one thought. And that's kind of strange when you got a 12-chapter thought. But the point is, if you look at it, it's connected. It's hard to find places to break for a sermon because you think about it. Every time you want to break, it's, and this, but that, etc. But it doesn't come through in the English necessarily, but in the original, it comes through, and the entire thing is one thought right through that. Once you get to about 12.6 or 12.7, you start having some bullet points and breaks. But up until then, it's just one thought the whole way through. And that's important to remember because you have to remember that each section builds on the previous section. One of the problems you have, and I go to the next one for a minute, I wrote this out just to show you what the theme of Romans would look like if you tried to be technically accurate. As I said in this to students previously, and I'll say to you if you're in a class somewhere, do not ever write a sentence like this and put it in a paper and try turning it into a professor. He will not like you and you won't like your grade. But if I were going to write a theme of Romans, I would actually say, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, has written to tell the Roman believers that the Gentiles seek enlightenment in themselves and Jews seek salvation through their birthright in the law. However, none of this brings justification, which is and always has been by faith through grace, which brings peace between believers and the Father through Jesus Christ. However, grace is not an excuse to sin, but instead grace brings obedience and a changed life, unlike the law, which brings the knowledge of sin and which brings death. Therefore, believers are free and there is no condemnation. However, Paul is sorrowful for his Jewish believers who are still in sin and blind. Nevertheless, God can choose whomsoever he chooses. Therefore, both Jews and Gentiles can now both be saved, and therefore, because of this, each of you present yourselves a living sacrifice that you may prove the will of God. As I said, don't ever try putting that into a paper. And it was a challenge to write that sentence, but that's one sentence. Kind of the way Paul wrote. That's what I looked at. Well, how does Paul write this letter? And it's kind of what he's doing through the whole thing. Now, again, one of the reasons this is important is because people try to find what is the theme of the book of Romans. And there's been debate over the years on the theme of Romans. Many people have said that the theme of Romans is justification. Could somebody read Romans 1, 16 and 17? Anybody who's got it? 1:16. Sally?
For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith.
Okay, which makes it very clear. You've got the just shall live by faith. Therefore, justification is obviously the theme. It's talking about righteousness there. Therefore, it's obvious, isn't it? The theme of Romans is justification. The problem is, that's just one step in the line. Because what it's starting with is Paul talking about how the Gentiles try to find salvation through their enlightenment, how the Jews try to find it through the law, and he goes on, and justification, if you see that as a theme, it's only one piece of it. And that's part of the problem is, if you concentrate on that, instead of looking at that, you got to look at, we got this incredible linguistic chain going along. Where does the chain come to a climax? What's the chain leading to? That's why I actually believe the theme can be found in chapter 12, not in chapter 1, which we'll get to in a second. Another theme which has been proposed over the years are that Jews and Gentiles can now both be saved and are equal in the church. That is absolutely true, but it's not the theme of the book. For one thing, if you look at that, while it's true, it lacks application. Okay, so they're equal, now what? And if you look at the book of Romans, it has the application in there. Now that you've done this, now that you're equal, now that you're both in the church, here's what should happen. So I don't like that as a theme of Romans either. Another theme which has been proposed over the years is that Paul is not ashamed of the gospel, which is the power of salvation. Kind of similar to the first one, uses the same verses, all true again, but not the theme, because the theme should state where the book's going, what the book's doing, so it's not really the theme. What I would propose instead is that living a changed life will prove that the will of God is salvation by grace through faith to both Jews and Gentiles. And the reason for this is it encapsulates its entire chain and finishes up in chapter 12, which is the fact that we live a transformed life because of who we are, because of what God's done for us. Now, before I go to the next step, any questions, any thoughts, comments? Don't be afraid. We can take them. Nope. Okay. Next thing we want to talk about is Martin Luther. Now, you may say to yourself, why are we talking about Martin Luther? We're in a Grace Brethren church. We're not in a Lutheran church. If you know anything about history, and by the way, yes, we are a Grace Brethren church. If you know anything about history, what you find is Luther was a pivotal point in history for a dramatic change in the way the church was going. Some people want to look at Luther and they want to say, okay, he was a crotchety old guy. True. He believed in infant baptism. We don't believe in that. True. His view of communion is completely different than ours. True. But think about where Luther was coming from. Luther was coming from the Catholic Church, which was completely bound up in a lot more than that, and not only that, but bound up in salvation through works plus faith. And even worse, at that point in time, the Catholic Church was doing what it called selling indulgences. Anybody here know what indulgences are and what it meant to sell indulgences? Anybody? I heard, Pardons, exactly. Basically pardons. But you'd buy them. So if you sinned, you go to the Pope, you go to your local priest, you go to whoever, hey, I need a pardon, whatever. And you could get plenary indulgences, which covered a whole mess of things. You could get individual indulgences. It was almost, the difference is we don't see it as salvation. It's almost like buying the memorial bricks on a wall or something, okay? Except that we don't see that as salvation. They saw that as, hey, I can just buy a pardon. So money would handle your way to get into heaven, essentially. Well, Luther was just furious at this. And the point is, though, the reason I'm bringing up Luther now is because Romans was the key to the change in Martin Luther. As a matter of fact, some people believe that Luther actually, some of the writings indicate, he may have actually become a Christian while he was a monk lecturing on the book of Romans during the lecture. We're not sure about that, but some believe that. The point being is, he hit Romans 1:17 and all of a sudden he's like, wait a second. How can this possibly tie in with what I've been taught in the church? And what we see is, first off, he looked at it and said, it's the righteousness of God. It doesn't say the righteousness of us. And Luther's starting to think, wait a second, righteousness of God, righteousness of us? Because if it's the righteousness of us, we work for it. We buy indulgences for it. We do whatever we have to. We get out of purgatory. But if it's the righteousness of God, how are we working for the righteousness of God? And he also then started looking at the word in the Greek for righteousness here, and realized that it wasn't to become righteous, but it was to be declared righteous. That's why we've talked in here about words in chapter 3, like legizomai, where it's talking about applying the righteousness of Christ to us. All of a sudden, Luther got it. Same thing we've talked about in here is the fact that it's not our righteousness to start with. It's Jesus Christ's righteousness applied to our account because of what Christ did, and therefore God declares us righteous and sees us righteous. We still sin, but we're seen righteous in God's eyes because His righteousness is applied to us. And not only that, it's also a wonderful reason to realize once we're saved, we can't lose our salvation, because I would say to you, aside from the indwelling of the Holy Spirit and a number of other things, what can you do that is so bad that you will screw up Christ's righteousness? We can't. I can't do that. You can't do that. We don't have that power. And all of a sudden it hit Luther in the middle of this. And Romans and Galatians in particular, with the death of the law in Galatians and with what happens in Romans, were the two books that suddenly got Luther into trouble, but which actually pivoted the church away from Catholicism and was really the breaking point of the Reformation. In addition to that, Luther came up with three things, all from the book of Romans, called the three solas: sola scriptura, sola fide, and sola gratia. We'll explain that in a moment. The sola scriptura means the Bible alone. Why was that important, that it's the Bible alone? Don't we believe that? Anybody know what was believed at that point in time? Robert, what did the Catholics believe?
They held the scripture, but they also held the church tradition.
Church traditions.
And papal announcements.
Right. You had several things. You had the Pope when he spoke what's called ex cathedra, or from the throne, from the chair. The point being is when the Pope spoke in a certain specific authoritative way, his words were not only equal to the Bible, but actually superior to the Bible. He could counteract the Bible. He could say, well, it used to be that way, but now it's this way. As a matter of fact, one interesting thing that I had a friend of mine who got his doctorate at Catholic U told me, he asked the Catholic theologians, says, you guys are right on interpreting all the Greek here. How is it that you're so messed up, well, didn't use those words, on these other things? And what they told him was, because the Bible was true when it was written. But in some cases, the Pope came later and said, whoops, this is superior, and the Pope was able to countermand things as time went on. We certainly don't believe that. Not only that, they believed that the church fathers were often on par with the Bible. You had, Augustine, you had Polycarp, Hippopotamus, oh wait, I'm not getting them right. Actually, that's one, there's one called, Hippolytus. And I always looked at that when I saw it spelled Hippolytus, and I always thought it was Hippolytus, which as we know is a small hippopotamus instead, so that doesn't work. And Polycarp, there was something very fishy about Polycarp, but I'm not sure what it was. Yeah, I know. I can't resist. Sorry, guys. The point is, though, they looked at all these church fathers and they said, you know something? These church fathers are on par with the Bible. We don't believe that. And you know what happened? Sola Scriptura by Luther said, we don't believe that either anymore. This came straight out of the book of Romans. This didn't come from anywhere else. It came straight out of Romans. The next one, sola fide, that was the Latin for by faith alone. Again, right out of Romans. That no works can bring about salvation. It's faith, period, nothing else. And then the third one is sola gratia. And the point of sola gratia is by grace alone, meaning it's faith that actually saves you, but it's grace, or it's faith as a mechanism for becoming saved, but grace is what actually saves you. It's the grace of God that gives you Christ's righteousness and applies it to you. So what he's saying is grace alone, faith alone, Scripture alone. Those are basically the three foundations we have. So we may disagree with Luther on infant baptism and on communion, but we sure don't disagree with him on those three items right there, on those solas. And the point is, all of that came from the book of Romans. And that's something that we often forget about, is the fact that Romans literally changed the entire church for all of history. Prior to that, the church in the first century was pretty good. Had issues, but pretty good. Second and third century started getting screwed up. Third, fourth century really screwed up in a lot of ways. Was screwed up for many, many years. And then suddenly you've got the Reformation come along, and I say suddenly, it happened over a period of a couple hundred years really for the whole thing, but this critical turning point with Luther happened all because of the book of Romans. It's one of the reasons I love studying the book of Romans. Next. I want to go on now to a few things that we need to be aware of. There are some rather heretical views of Romans that have come up in the last 100 years. A lot of these are categorized under the term the new perspective. I'm not going to try to define that. The reason being is the people that hold the new perspective on Romans all disagree on what it means. So therefore, but what I'm going to do is instead is tell you several of the things they believe. Again, I just learned a lesson. Don't put water down your windpipe. I should have learned that 2 weeks ago. I don't know, I messed it up again. One of the interpretations is that Jews are saved still based on covenantal election, not works. Essentially, you get it because you were born that way. It would almost be like Gene coming up and saying he was born into the Grace Brethren Church here, and therefore he's saved. You don't believe that, do you? Okay, good. I want to make sure. We'd have to get rid of him as an elder if he did. Point is that it means that they believe that they had a God-given right to be saved because of who they were. Because they're Israel, after all, they're the children of Israel, and I mean Israel the person, not the nation here. And the point being is that obviously we don't believe that, but there are some people that believe that, and one of the problems with that is they actually believe that still goes today. As a matter of fact, there are people who have preached in evangelical churches that Jews are saved one way and non-Jews are saved another way, and therefore we shouldn't even witness to Jews. Because after all, we don't want to screw up God's other plan of salvation. We don't believe that, but some people believe that about Romans. I will say this. One of the reasons we have to know about this is that if you were to take chapter 2 and especially chapter 2 and 4 and take pieces, especially chapter 2, and take pieces of it out of context, you could easily prove works-based salvation for the Jews. But it's completely out of context. In context, you go, oh, wait, that's not what it means. So therefore, we have to know about these things so we can avoid these little landmines. Second interpretation also that some people believe is that Gentiles can now be saved under the law. Where they got that from the book of Romans mystifies me, but that's actually an interpretation out there. No, we don't believe the law saves anyone. Never did save anyone. It was always by grace, always by the Messiah. For Israel, the coming Messiah. For us, looking back on the Messiah who's already been here. But the point being is there are some believe that now Jews and Gentiles are both saved under the law and from the book of Romans. The other thing that I want to hit here is kind of a summary, and we're kind of closing up here. I want to hit a summary so that you'll remember the first 3 chapters of Romans. Very easy to remember. Romans starts out talking about the wrong ways for things to happen. And I kind of modified it. I used to say, chapter 1, Gentiles are scum. Chapter 2, Jews are scum. Chapter 3, we're all scum. Well, I've now said instead, chapter 1, Gentiles are lost. Chapter 2, Jews are lost. Chapter 3, we're all lost, up until verse 21. The point being is, Paul goes through 3 distinct ways of people trying to get to God on their own to show they don't work. Chapter 1 is all about the Gentiles and not only that, what you have to remember is the Gentiles and the Jews had different thought processes in many cases for what they were trusting in. So he goes through each one and shows, look, you want to be a Gentile and get to heaven? This ain't going to work. You want to be a Jew and get to heaven in chapter 2? That ain't going to work. For everybody else, doesn't matter. We're all covered by this and we're all in the same boat. So summary of the first 3 chapters, just to remember. Chapter 1, Gentiles are lost. Chapter 2, Jews are lost. Chapter 3, we're all lost. Any more questions? And I know this has sounded more like a class today than a sermon, but we needed to do this simply because there's so much in the book of Romans we're going to hit. I have to say this. If you said to me I could only have one book of the Bible for the rest of my life to study, this is the book I would pick as the book of Romans. I don't think there's any book that's more exciting, more complete, or more complete and comprehensive, same thing. It's a book that I absolutely love the logic of the book. I love the way it's laid out by Paul. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? If not, we're going to go ahead and close in prayer. And next week, we will actually get into the verses and start finding out what's in the book of Romans, starting in the first chapter. Let's go ahead and bow in prayer.